The wheel broke without warning. One moment, the stagecoach was rocking steadily along the dry dirt road. The next, it lurched sideways with a crack that split the air like a whip. The horse neighed wildly, the driver cursed, and everything crashed into dust. Althea Rivers hit the ground hard. For a few seconds, the world went silent. Only her heartbeat thundered in her chest. She drew a long breath, forced herself to stay calm, and pushed up on her scraped palms. Blood oozed from her hands. Her dress was torn, but she was still in one piece. The driver wrestled with the reins, while two elderly passengers and a traveling merchant huddled inside the tilted carriage, too afraid to move. Althea didn't wait for help. She brushed the dust off her skirt, went to the injured horse, and knelt beside it. The leather strap had cut deep into its leg, blood seeping fast. She tore a strip from her underskirt and wrapped it tight, her hands steady and practiced. She had bandaged worse wounds before, on people who lived and on those who didn't. The driver glanced at her and sighed. "You're better at this than I am," he said hoarsely. "I'll wait for the next wagon. There's one from Cheyenne coming by at dawn." Althea nodded. "You should stay with them. Don't burn through your firewood too soon." The old couple murmured thanks. The merchant offered her some dry biscuits, but she shook her head. "Keep them," she said. "I've still got a road ahead." The prairie wind swept across the barren ground, tasting of dust and iron. Ahead of her, low hills shimmered in the heat. No houses, no trees. Red Bluff was still half a day's walk away. She squinted at the horizon, judging whether she could reach it before dark. Then came the sound of hoofbeats behind her. A man rode down from the ridge, a tall figure with broad shoulders, his dark coat casting a long shadow across the dirt. The evening sun cut across his sun-browned face, revealing gray, smoky eyes, steady and deep. He reined in his horse, surveying the wreck. "You hurt?" His voice was low and even, unhurried. Althea brushed dust from her hands. "Nothing worse than before." He dismounted and stepped closer, his movements slow and sure. "Axles snapped," he said after a glance. "You won't fix that without a blacksmith." "I figured as much." The corner of his mouth twitched, half a smile that never quite formed. "Name's Grant McCoy. Got a cabin a few miles west, closer than Red Bluff." She said nothing. The sun was sinking fast, the wind turning cold. The driver still struggled with the horses, the passengers huddled by their luggage. Grant didn't press her, just stood there, hands loose at his sides. "If you stay out here tonight, you'll freeze," he said finally. "I've had worse nights." "Maybe, but you shouldn't face one alone." There was no pity in his tone, and that, more than anything, made her hesitate. She looked back at the coach, where the driver had managed to start a small fire. "Will they be all right?" Grant nodded. "I'll leave them some wood and water. Another wagon'll pass by come morning." She exhaled softly, then turned toward the west where the light was fading. "I've got a knife," she said. "Good. Means you know how to take care of yourself." He stepped aside, tilting his head in quiet invitation. She didn't take his hand, just climbed up behind him. When Grant tugged the reins, the horse snorted and moved into the trail. They rode in silence for a long time. The wind loosened her hairpins, strands whipping free. The plains stretched wide and gold, then slowly turned gray as the sun dipped low. She held one hand to the saddle, the other clutching her worn leather bag, all she owned now. "You're from the east?" he asked, eyes still on the horizon. "Richmond," she said. "I worked as a nurse in a field hospital." He gave a short nod. "That's honorable work." "Until the war ended, and they wanted us gone." He didn't answer. No sympathy, no empty words, just the quiet and the wind between them. Althea breathed deep, her shoulders easing. The horizon melted into violet dusk. Then he spoke again, softer this time, as if reminding himself. "You'd freeze out here by nightfall." She turned to him, her dark eyes catching the dying light. A faint smile touched her lips. "Then I suppose you'll have to share your fire." The sky turned black before they saw the cabin. Wind swept across the plains like a whip, spinning red dust around the horses' hooves. To the west, clouds sank low, thick and heavy as lead. When the first drops struck her face, Althea only lowered her head and tightened her grip on the saddle. They reached the cabin just as the rain poured down in sheets. Grant dismounted first, tied the horse under the awning, and pushed open the door. A rush of dry wood and smoke greeted them, familiar to him, foreign to her. The cabin held only one room, rough-hewn walls, a few simple things, a hearth, a table, 2 chairs, a narrow shelf. Althea stood near the door, her clothes soaked through, one hand resting on the knife at her waist. Grant moved to the fireplace and began to build the fire, each motion steady, deliberate. The flame caught quickly. Light climbed the walls, pushing back the damp chill. Rain hammered the roof, wind howled through the pines. The small room became a fragile refuge between 2 worlds. One of storm, one of silence. She didn't move at first. On Grant's sun-browned face, sweat and rain mixed into a faint sheen. He took some cornmeal, a bit of dried meat, a pinch of old coffee. Without a word, she stepped forward and added more dry wood to the basket by the hearth. The scent of burning pine spread, sharp, comforting. She slipped off her cloak, hung it near the fire to dry. The damp fabric of her dress clung cold and heavy, but as the warmth reached her skin, she began to feel herself again. Grant set 2 tin cups on the table. A moment later, the smell of strong coffee filled the air. She took one, her hands trembling slightly as the heat seeped into her palms. He said nothing, just pushed another log into the fire. The simple gesture unsettled her more than any word could have. Rain beat the roof in steady waves. She sat down, eyes turned toward the window, where everything beyond had dissolved into white. Once in a while, lightning flashed, cutting across his face, showing fine lines at the corners of his eyes, marks not of age, but of years spent in silence. He ate first, quietly, as if words were unnecessary. When she took her first bite, the cornbread tasted dry and plain, but it carried the truth of fire. The air between them wasn't distant, only unhurried. There was a quiet respect in the space that separated them, as if both knew not to ask what didn't need answering. After a long while, she spoke softly, almost to herself. "Tonight, the rain won't stop." Grant didn't turn. He only nodded once. "You're safe here." The words fell into the room like a spark meeting water, small, round, and still warm. Althea didn't reply. She set her cup down and looked into the fire. In its flickering light, her eyes held something tender, not fear, but the strange ache of being seen. The storm raged outside, yet inside the cabin, everything slowed. The fire burned steady, not fierce, just enough to see each other, 2 strangers, 2 weary bodies rediscovering the warmth of being alive. Dawn broke through a thick veil of mist, as if the storm had only been a dream. The ground was soft and wet, the scent of earth and pine heavy in the air. Droplets slid from the roof, falling in rhythm with the slow breath of morning. Althea woke when the first pale light brushed the cabin walls. The room was still, filled only with the faint trace of smoke from last night's fire. The borrowed blanket lay over her, heavy and warm. She sat up, scanning the quiet space. Grant was gone. Through the open door, she saw him sitting on the porch, pouring hot water from a tin kettle into an old coffee pot. Steam drifted upward, blending into the fog. She wrapped her coat around her shoulders and stepped outside. The ground squelched softly underfoot. He turned at the sound, nodded once and poured her a cup. The coffee was strong, bitter and warm, the smoke mingling with the damp air. They sat side by side, a single empty chair between them. Wind moved through the pines. Everything felt unhurried. The fire was dead, but its warmth still lingered. Grant sliced the leftover cornbread, warmed it over the coals, and handed her a piece. She accepted it with a small nod in place of thanks. They ate in silence, the quiet filled only by the scrape of a knife and the flutter of a bird's wings in the trees. For the first time, her gaze lost its guarded edge. Behind the weariness in her eyes, there was a faint trace of trust. He noticed, not through words, but in the way her hand no longer rested on the knife hidden beneath her coat. After a while, his voice broke the stillness, calm and even. "Where will you go from here?" "Red Bluff," she said, eyes fixed on the fog-draped fields. "I heard there's an inn looking for help. Maybe they'll take me." He nodded once. "I'm headed that way. I can take you halfway." She turned to him, hesitating. Out here, every favor had a cost. But his eyes stayed steady, neither asking nor insisting. It was just an offer. Her voice came quiet, almost a breath. "You're not afraid of trouble?" "No," he said simply. "I just don't leave folks stranded." Althea said nothing. Part of her wanted to refuse. The rest was too tired to fight. She gave a small, firm nod. "All right." He gathered his things, led the horse from the shed. When she approached, he had already tied an extra rein for her seat. She studied the animal, then him, before mounting without help. Grant smiled faintly, just enough that she didn't see it. They rode through the soaked plains, the horse's hooves thudding softly against the mud. The sky hadn't cleared, but the light had returned, spilling silver across the land. Puddles shone like mirrors at every turn. Althea sat behind him, gripping the saddle. Her eyes wandered toward the horizon, where clouds hung low over the hills, vast, calm, endless enough to make her forget where she had been. For a long stretch, neither spoke. The wind carried strands of her hair across her face, mixed with the scent of leather and rain. His breathing was steady, measured, like the echo of a storm long gone. As the path dipped into the valley, Althea's voice came low, almost lost to the wind. "I stopped believing in kindness a long time ago." Grant didn't turn. The breeze carried half her words away, but he heard enough. "Then maybe," he said quietly, "it's time to believe again." The words were simple, no comfort, no persuasion, but they sank deep, quiet as rain on earth. They kept riding, saying nothing more. Yet between the rhythm of hoofbeats and the hush of the plains, something had begun, small, still, and real enough not to need a name. The town of Red Bluff appeared in the valley like a pale brown smudge against the desert. Rows of wooden houses stood close together, their low roofs breathing thin trails of smoke from stovepipes. The main street was rutted with wagon tracks, dust mixed with dried mud. Althea looked around as Grant pulled the horse to a stop in front of a 2-story white-painted building, Mercer's boarding house. He dismounted first, offered his hand, but she stepped down on her own. Their eyes met for a brief moment. No long goodbyes. only the quiet understanding of two people who had once shared a storm. "You'll be fine," Grant said, his voice low, steady. "You believe that?" He gave a slow nod, a faint curve of his mouth. "I know it." Then he turned his horse and rode off in the opposite direction, his figure darkening in the golden dust of late afternoon. She stood there until the sound of hoofbeats faded away. Mrs. Mercer, a widow in her 50s, opened the door. Her face was stern, her gray eyes sharp as steel, her tone brisk, leaving no room for explanation. "Looking for work?" "Yes, ma'am. I can cook and tend to the house." "Where from?" "Richmond Hospital." "Good, you can try. But I don't keep lazy folks." She turned and gestured for Althea to follow. The house was clean, carrying the scent of soap and candle wax. At the end of the hall was the kitchen, the place where she would begin. The first days passed in exhaustion. She rose before dawn, heated water, washed linens, scrubbed floors, then helped prepare breakfast for the boarders. By noon, she washed dishes, then began again for supper. The work never ended, but it gave her something she hadn't known in years: rhythm, steadiness, a life where no one asked and no one pitied. Red Bluff wasn't kind to strangers, especially not to a black woman alone. There were cold stares, whispers she caught through half-closed doors. But Althea learned not to answer. She kept her head down, worked hard, spoke little, and always with calm respect. At night, when the town quieted, she often sat alone in the small attic room, gazing at the dim line of hills beyond. Each time the wind rose, she thought of that night in the cabin, the firelight, the rain, and the gray smoked eyes of the man who had said only, "You're safe here." One late afternoon, as she carried a basket of linens to the public well, she heard the sound of hooves. The rhythm was so familiar, her heart tightened. Grant was riding down the main street, stopping at the general store. He dismounted, spoke briefly to the shopkeeper, then picked up a small bag of salt. When he turned, their eyes met across the distance of a few yards. He didn't come closer. He only gave a small, steady nod, the kind of greeting shared by two people who understood words weren't needed. She didn't move, her hands still gripping the basket. The sun was setting, casting a pale gold over the street, blurring everything except the look they shared, quiet, held, and true. Grant slipped the bag of salt into his coat pocket, mounted his horse, and rode away. He didn't look back, but as he reached the end of the street, she saw his hand lift to the brim of his hat, a polite, restrained gesture, just like the first day they met. When his figure vanished beyond the bend, Althea realized the corners of her mouth had lifted, a faint smile, fragile, so small that only the sunset could have seen it. It was the first smile since the day she left the East, not from joy, but from the quiet knowing that somewhere out there, someone still remembered she existed. That evening, sunlight stretched long across the fields behind Mercer's boarding house, still and golden, as if the whole town of Red Bluff was holding its breath before dusk. Althea carried 2 wooden buckets down to the stream. The recent rain had filled it high again, cool, clear, reflecting the sky like a fractured mirror. She knelt by the muddy bank, steadying the bucket as she dipped it into the water. Her hands trembled slightly in the wind. The horizon blurred in the distance. A lone bird drifted over the hills. She thought she would never see him again. The man who had brought her here, then disappeared like wind after a storm. But then came the sound of hoofbeats behind her. Slow, sure, unmistakable. Grant dismounted, led his horse closer to the stream, and tied it beneath a birch tree. He carried a leather pouch of salt and a few blacksmith tools. "Need a hand?" His voice didn't intrude. It simply existed beside her. Althea turned, said nothing. Still, he stooped down and took hold of the rope, pulling the bucket up with her. Their hands brushed for only a moment, but the warmth of it was real, solid, grounding. They poured the water into the large barrel, then sat side by side on a flat stone. The stream ran over their boots, carrying with it a few drifting leaves, spinning aimlessly in the current. She didn't look at him when she spoke, her voice small, almost afraid the wind might carry it away. "I was once engaged." Grant didn't move. Only the murmur of water and the faint scrape of cloth between them. He was a doctor, kind, admired, respected, and I was just a nurse in training. She smiled, though there was no joy in it. He said he wanted to marry me. I believed him, but then he chose someone else, the daughter of the hospital's owner. I didn't cry. I just left. Grant stayed silent. The light was fading, slipping across the surface of the stream in long golden streaks. "I didn't leave because I was hurt," she went on quietly. "I left because if I stayed, I would have forgotten who I was." It took him a long while to answer. "You don't regret it?" She shook her head. "I only regret believing people will be kind just because you are." Grant studied her. The last of the sun touched her face, strong and weary at once. He said softly, almost as a breath, "Good." She frowned slightly. "Good? It means you lived." The words stopped her. In the sound of wind and water, memories stirred, the sharp scent of antiseptic, the hand that once held hers and then let go, the long nights wondering what she had done wrong. Here, beside the quiet stream, Althea understood she no longer needed anyone to prove her worth. She straightened, eyes steady. "You don't want to know more?" "No," Grant said, gaze fixed on the current. "Some things only need to be said once." The last light slipped behind the ridge, leaving the air tinted bronze and still. She rose and brushed the dust from her skirt. He took up the rope and lifted the water barrel onto the cart for her. As they walked back toward town, Grant slowed his pace until his stride matched hers. They didn't speak again, but something had shifted between them. Not a promise, not pity, just understanding. Near the edge of the woods, she said softly, almost to herself, "I'm not the same woman I was." Grant looked at her. In the dusk, his voice came low, clear, without effort. "Good. It means you lived." She didn't answer, just smiled, faint and sure. They kept walking, side by side, down the damp road glistening with stream water, two people moving in quiet rhythm, neither ahead nor behind, as if they had finally found a pace that needed no name. Summer returned with its first storm, a sudden, heavy rain, as if the sky itself wanted to wash the dryness from the earth. Althea was walking back from the boarding house when the wind rose. Dark clouds smothered the hills, thunder rolled, and within minutes the rain came down like a flood. She clutched her thin cloak tight, her steps dragging through the mud. The road back to Red Bluff had vanished beneath the torrent. There was only one place nearby she could reach, the old cabin on the hillside. When Althea knocked, Grant opened the door almost at once, as if he'd heard the rain announce her coming. No questions, no surprise. He simply stepped aside and let her in. The door closed behind them, and the world outside dissolved into wind. Her clothes were drenched, hair plastered to her forehead, breath unsteady and sharp. Grant rekindled the fire, spread a thick blanket across the back of a chair. She took off her cloak and sat near the hearth, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to warm them. Neither spoke for a while. Only the sound of rain drumming on the roof, the faint crackle of wood as it caught flame. The firelight grew, painting the walls in soft amber. Grant sat across from her, the glow cutting across his sun-worn face, deepening the gray of his eyes. Between them was a quiet, not strained, not distant, just unspoken understanding. When warmth finally returned to her fingers, Althea spoke, her voice drifting with the rain. "I'm not like the women you've known, Grant. I'm not untouched, not whole." He lifted his head but didn't interrupt. "I believed promises," she went on, "and I was used, then left behind, as if I was nothing." She gave a faint smile, not bitter, only tired of carrying shame. "I don't tell you this for pity. I just don't want you to see me through an illusion." Grant rose, his boots creaking against the floorboards. He walked toward her, each step slow, deliberate. When he stopped, the distance between them was no more than the sound of their own breathing. He reached out and placed his hand gently against her cheek, his thumb tracing the dampness still clinging to her skin. "I never needed you to be unbroken," he said, voice low and firm. "Only honest." She looked up in the firelight, their eyes met, and there was nothing left to hide. Just two people, both carrying the weight of old wounds, finding something warmer than fear between them. The kiss came as naturally as a breath. No intent, no hesitation. He leaned in and she met him halfway. Their lips touched softly, then deeper, unhurried, quiet. Outside, rain hammered the roof, wind whipped the eaves, but inside the small cabin, everything softened. No words were spoken, only the scent of smoke, rain, and skin. Time slipped away. The hollow places within her, the dark corners left by years of loss, filled with the stillness of this moment. Grant rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling. There were no promises, no claims, only the sense that at last they had stopped running from the past, from fear, from the things neither dared to name. The fire burned low, but the warmth lingered between them. She closed her eyes and leaned into his shoulder. The rain hadn't stopped, yet she no longer felt cold. For the first time in years, Althea wasn't living to endure, or breathing just to survive. She simply lived, fully, quietly, and whole. Dawn came slowly after the storm, hesitant, as if the sky itself was shy before their first morning. The rain had stopped, but the earth was still damp, filled with the mingled scent of grass and wood smoke. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to red embers. Pale light slipped through the cracks in the door, falling in long bands across the floorboards. Althea woke in silence. The room was still warm, broken only by the distant sound of the horse snorting outside. Grant was gone, but his coat hung over the chair, still carrying his warmth. She sat up, folded the blanket neatly, and dressed. Her fingers brushed a faint scratch on her neck, a mark from the night before, soft but real. In that small moment, she felt no shame, no confusion, only the quiet peace of someone who had finally been seen, without judgment, without disguise. Grant came in, bringing the scent of morning mist and the sound of hooves. He set a pail of water down, washed his hands, said nothing. Althea moved to the hearth, gathered the last pieces of kindling, and coaxed the fire back to life. Their gestures were small, wordless, and yet in rhythm, like their bodies had learned to speak for them. Breakfast was simple: coffee, cold cornbread, a few strips of dried meat. She laid out the dishes. He poured the water. Everything unfolded slowly, naturally, needing no discussion. When Grant sat down, the light from the window fell across his shoulder, tracing the sinew of his wrist as he lifted his cup. Althea saw it, and realized suddenly that he was no longer a stranger. He was the first man to touch her without making her want to pull away. They ate in silence, not the silence of regret, but the calm of people who knew that words would only disturb what was already understood. Afterward, she cleared the dishes while he stepped outside to the stables. The faint clang of metal, the shuffle of hooves, the creak of a wooden door, all drifted together into a soft morning rhythm. She stood by the window, watching him. Out on the wet grass, he bent to tighten a saddle strap, his hair damp with dew, his shirt dark with moisture. When he looked up, their eyes met. Neither looked away. A moment passed between them, simple, still, and true. When Grant returned, she was tying her satchel closed. "You're leaving?" His voice was low, neither a question nor reproach. "I have to get back before Mrs. Mercer notices. If not, I'll lose the job." He nodded, fingers still around the coffee cup. "You can come back, if you want." The words were light, but they lingered in the air longer than anything else. Not a plea, not a promise, just an open door, waiting. Althea paused, her hands tightening on the strap of her bag. In that stillness, she understood. There were no vows, no assurances, but within this small cabin she had found what no one else had ever offered her, peace that asked for nothing in return. She turned to him, half her face caught in the full morning light, shimmering like dew over grass. "I'll remember that," she said. Grant nodded once, lips curving into a faint, unfinished smile. He didn't move toward her, didn't take her hand. Yet his gaze followed her every step to the door. When Althea opened it, the wind rushed in, carrying the fresh, damp scent of earth and new grass. She stood in the doorway, looking out at the wide plain. Before stepping away, she glanced back at him, the man standing in the pale morning, quiet and steady, as if he belonged to the house itself. She smiled, a small smile, but one that dissolved every distance left between them. For the first time, she smiled not to hide pain, not to seem strong. She smiled in acceptance of the truth that some things arrive exactly when we no longer dare to hope. Then she stepped outside. The door closed behind her, its sound folding into the wind. The cabin was still again, but the band of sunlight across the floor remained, long, warm, and beautiful, like something left unfinished, yet enough. The autumn wind carried its first chill. Life in Red Bluff had settled into a calm rhythm, so quiet that Althea began to believe she had outrun everything that once bound her. Each morning she rose before dawn, heated water, washed linens, prepared breakfast for the boarders. By afternoon, she sat by the well, listening to the wind threading through the willows behind the house. Her days were simple, her peace unbroken, until the day he came. Calvin Walker, the man she had once almost called husband. He arrived in town on a dust-caked carriage, his vest rumpled, his smile the same as ever, polished, easy to trust, and hollow. The moment he stepped down, his eyes swept the street and found her almost instantly. "Althea Rivers," he said, half surprised, half smug. "I knew it. You were never one to get far." She froze, her hands still gripping the basket of linens. He came closer, bringing with him the smell of whiskey and smoke. "I came for you," he said, lowering his voice to a practiced softness. "I was wrong. You left before I could explain. What happened? It was a misunderstanding." Althea met his gaze without blinking. Every piece of the past, the promises, the nights waiting while he gambled, the mornings alone in a damp rented room rose before her like smoke in the wind. "What do you want, Calvin?" Her tone was low, steady. He faltered for a moment at her calm. "I just wanted to talk. I heard you've done well here. Steady job, a bit saved up. I'm glad for you, truly." But his eyes told another story. The eyes of a man doing the math before the conversation ends. That evening, Grant rode into town to buy salt and wire. The saloon at the end of the street was alive with laughter and the sour smell of beer. As he stepped inside, the noise swelled around a familiar voice. Rough, loud, self-satisfied. Calvin sat at the bar, bragging about the wife who'd left him, about the money she owed. Grant said nothing. He walked up beside him, ordered a drink, and stood silently at the counter. When Calvin turned, he met a gaze that was calm, unflinching, so still it stripped away pretense. "Who are you supposed to be?" Calvin asked, his grin twitching. Grant didn't answer. He drank slowly, eyes never leaving the man. There was no threat in them, no anger, just the kind of silence that makes a liar stop talking. Calvin's smirk faltered. He fumbled for his hat. "I was only joking." Then he left, and the room fell heavy, like thunder that had rolled close but hadn't struck yet. The next morning, Althea waited by the well, where she and Calvin had first crossed paths in Red Bluff. She knew he would come. Men like him always did, when they believed fear might still open a door. "You've changed," he said, his voice caught between mockery and nostalgia. "But you're still the same, still with that look, still don't know how to bow." "Maybe," she replied evenly, "because I'm no longer yours to bow to." He laughed thinly. "I'm not here to fight. I just want back what's mine. There's nothing of yours left here." The wind picked up, flinging droplets from the well's edge between them. She stood tall, her voice calm enough to make him step back. "I'm not something for you to reclaim. You used me, left me, and I survived. You don't get to touch this life again." Calvin stared, then turned away. The look of a man realizing his prey no longer feared him. That afternoon, as the sun tilted low, Althea left the town behind. The road out of Red Bluff was quiet, painted gold by dust and wind. She walked until she reached Grant's cabin, the only place that had ever felt like rest. From afar, she saw him at the back field, mending the fence. Each strike of his hammer was steady and certain, beating like the pulse of the land itself. He didn't look up as she approached. Only when she stopped by the row of posts did he lift his gaze. There was no surprise, no question, just the knowing of a man who already understood. Althea smiled faintly. "You're rebuilding the fence?" "Yeah," Grant said, his tone quiet, grounded. "Autumn winds are rough. Figured I'd make it stronger." She nodded, standing beside him, watching him work in the fading light. No explanations, no need for rescue, only his presence, steady, patient, and enough. The storm of the past had passed, and Althea knew now she didn't have to run anymore. After the day Calvin left Red Bluff, the town settled back into its quiet rhythm, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. But for Althea, that quiet was no longer the same. It carried a strange aftertaste, like the warmth that lingers after a flame has gone out. No longer burning, but not yet cold. She went on with her days as before. Up before sunrise, boiling water, washing linens, cooking meals. Mrs. Mercer spoke little, yet there was a gentleness now in her eyes, as though she understood that this woman had walked through something that could not easily be spoken aloud. As for Althea, she had no wish to tell. Some things, once finished, needed no witnesses. In the late afternoons, when the shadows stretched long across the porch, she often left the town, following the dirt path she now knew by heart. No one sent her, no one stopped her. Only her feet seemed to know where they belonged. Grant was always there, where he always was, on that open patch of land, finishing the fence line. Each swing of his hammer was steady, deliberate, patient. The rhythm of it thudded deep in her chest, not painful, but heavy in a way that felt real. He looked up when he heard her steps, his gray eyes unchanged, calm, unreadable. "You all right?" She nodded. "He's gone. And you stayed." She met his gaze, the late sun tracing sharp lines along his jaw. "I don't think I'll be running anymore." Grant drove another nail into the post, then set his hammer down. "I didn't save you, Althea," he said quietly. "I don't do that for anyone. I know. I just build fences." His voice carried a rough calm, every word chosen with care. "To keep what needs keeping, and to keep out what shouldn't return, that's all." She stood silent for a while, listening to the wind move through the grass. The hills beyond shimmered with motion, like waves in slow tide. "Then," she said softly, "let me build it with you." He turned slightly, narrowing his eyes against the light. "Build? Yes. If you build fences to hold what you value, then I want to hold my share too. I'm done running, Grant. I want to rebuild." Silence lingered between them. Only the faint creak of a post shifted in the wind. Then Grant nodded. No smile, just a quiet acceptance. He bent down, picked up the spare hammer, and handed it to her. "Then let's begin." She took it, awkward in her grip, her hands uncertain but willing. He stood near, close enough for her to feel his breath, but not close enough to touch. They worked together. He held, she struck. The rhythm grew steady, the sound of wood and iron blending with the sigh of the wind. One post after another rose in line, straight and sure. Now and then they stopped. He dipped a cloth into the bucket and wiped the sweat from his neck. She steadied the next beam, their eyes meeting briefly, without hesitation this time. As the sunlight melted into honey tones, Grant stepped, back to look at the half-finished fence. "Not bad," he said. "Stronger when built together," she answered, catching her breath. He crouched, scooped a handful of soil, and let it crumble between his fingers. "You're not afraid of getting dirt on your hands?" "No," she said, smiling. "Dirt reminds you you're touching something real." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once, as if her words had fastened themselves somewhere deep inside him. They stood still together, watching the sun drop behind the hills. The shadows of the new fence stretched long across the grass, straight, even, and whole. It wasn't just a wall dividing inside from out. It was proof that two people, once broken, had learned how to build something again with their own hands. When the sky darkened, Althea brushed the dust from her palms and spoke softly, her voice steady. "This fence, I think it's not only to keep things out, but to keep something in." Grant nodded. "Yes, to keep what's worth keeping." They said nothing more, just stood side by side, watching the last of the light fade. On the ground, the scent of fresh-cut wood lingered. Everything was still unfinished, but it was standing firm. Winter came early, carrying the sharp scent of smoke and pine across the valley. Red Bluff lay shrouded in fog, and Grant's cabin, tucked among the pines, shone like a faint point of light in a gray world. Since Althea had moved in, the house had changed. Not brighter exactly, but alive. An apron drying on the line, a bundle of dried flowers on the table, faint traces of ash on the floor they both forgot to sweep. Each morning, Grant left early for the fields, and she stayed behind, boiling water, scrubbing linens, baking cornbread. When he returned, the smell of coffee always greeted him. Day by day, without promises or beginnings, a quiet rhythm had taken root. One morning, while Grant was planning a new wooden frame, Althea stood beside him, watching the light filter through the wall. "This cabin only has one window," she said, as if thinking aloud. "It's enough light," he answered, still working. "No," she smiled. "Morning light is never enough. I want another window, to let the sunrise in so the day doesn't have to wait." Grant stopped. He looked up and saw her eyes catch the light. Deep, dark, and warm. "Then we'll make one." So they began. He measured, she marked. He sawed. She caught the sawdust. The air filled with the scent of pine resin and steel. Now and then, a shaving of wood landed in her hair. She brushed it off, laughing softly, the first laugh he had ever heard from her. When the final board came loose, sunlight flooded the room, bright and clean, making them squint. The cabin seemed to breathe, opening wider, warmer, and freer than before. Althea stood by the new frame, her hands covered in dust, her hair fallen loose over her shoulders. "What do you think?" she asked. Grant set the hammer down and leaned against the wall, his eyes steady on her. "You make silence look like home." She stood still for a moment. The wind slipped through the new window, lifting the ribbon that tied her hair. She didn't turn away. His gaze wasn't that of a man admiring. It was the look of someone who had found where he belonged. They worked through the afternoon, smoothing the frame, sweeping the floor, hanging a curtain she had sewn from an old cloth. By sundown, the cabin had 2 windows, one for light, one for the hills. Inside, the quiet remained, but it no longer felt lonely. That night, as they ate by the fire, Althea spoke softly, not looking directly at him. "I once thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone. Not because I feared it, but because I didn't believe anyone could really understand me." Grant set his spoon down. "And now?" She lifted her head, firelight warming her face, no longer shadowed but sure. "Now I think I was wrong." They sat in the silence that followed. Neither spoke again. The fire cracked softly. The wind murmured against the new window. The next morning, the first snow fell, light, delicate. Flakes gathered on the new frame and melted in the sun. Althea brought out 2 cups of coffee, handing one to him on the porch. Grant took it, his eyes calm but full. "I used to think this was how life would be," he said. "Work, sleep, work again, alone. But now I think I want more than that." She tilted her head. "More?" "Someone to share it with. Someone who doesn't have to say much, but who'll still be there when morning comes, so I know I'm seen." A pause. Then Althea smiled faintly. "Are you asking me to marry you, Grant McCoy?" He nodded, the ghost of a smile passing across his face. "If you'll have me." She didn't answer right away. She looked around. The small cabin, the fence, the 2 windows they'd made together. Then she nodded once. "All right. But I want a wedding with only 2 witnesses. You and me." Grant let out a low, quiet laugh, then reached for her hand. Outside, snow kept falling. On the ground, on the roof, on their joined hands. 2 hands that had known loss and labor, yet were now building something truer than either had ever dared to dream. A beginning. Winter came quietly, like a guest who asked for nothing. No storms, no roar, just slow, steady layers of white that covered the roof, the doorstep, and every small crack the summer had left behind. The house with 2 windows became their refuge from the cold. Inside, Althea and Grant had found a rhythm of living that needed no words, no explanations, only the ease of 2 people who no longer measured their worth by what they had lost. Each morning, she woke first, rekindled the fire, brewed coffee. Grant went out to the stables, shoveled snow, fed the horses, and brought in a stack of dry wood. Sometimes he paused by the porch, glanced through the window where she stood, and nodded, a quiet greeting that said more than words ever could. When the snow deepened, the road to town closed. The small school in the village shut its doors, and someone asked Althea if she would teach the children until spring. She agreed. Each afternoon, a handful of children trudged through the snow to the cabin, cheeks red, boots wet. They sat around the kitchen table, reading aloud from worn pages, their voices uneven and bright. Ink stained the table, laughter filled the room, and the house seemed to grow larger for it. Grant often stood on the porch, listening, the saw still in his hand, his mouth pressed thin, but his eyes soft. He never said so, but she knew he was proud. By evening, the snow turned to sleet. Althea hung clothes by the hearth while Grant patched the eaves. The light from the 2 windows spilled golden across the drifts outside, a warm square of life against the frozen world. No one in town called them newlyweds, yet everyone said the same. The cabin by the pines never lets its fire die. Night belonged to them, not in passion's blaze, but in the quiet peace of 2 souls who no longer needed to hide the broken parts of themselves. One night, the snow came heavy again, the wind scraping at the glass. Grant added wood to the fire while Althea sat curled in her chair, reading from the small medical notebook she had carried from the East. He sat across from her, whittling the handle of a wooden chair, carving his initials into the grain. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked, eyes still on the flames. "Used to," he said. "Many times. After the war, I didn't think I'd ever want to see another soul. But the farther I went, the more I found I was still carrying what I couldn't leave behind." She looked up. "What things?" "The sound of gunfire. The faces of men I couldn't save." Althea nodded, gaze lowered. "I have faces too. They come and go. I used to think, if I'd done better, maybe." Her voice caught, thin as thread. Grant didn't interrupt. He simply reached across the table, brushed his fingers lightly against hers where she gripped the edge of the blanket. The touch was brief, but it steadied her, pulled her back into the room. In that moment, they both understood. Some things didn't need to be spoken anymore. Outside, the snow fell heavier, covering the roof, the window frames, and everything that came before. Inside, the fire glowed steady, its light trembling across the walls, like memories, not gone, only gentled. They stayed like that a long while, sharing the silence, sharing the warmth. When the fire dimmed to a slow pulse, Althea whispered almost to herself, "Some wounds never close, but maybe we don't have to bleed alone." Grant watched her for a long time. He said nothing, only leaned forward and laid another log on the fire. The flames rose again, flickering over their faces, tired, weathered, but at peace. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, warmth lingered. And between 2 people who had once been broken, something new had taken root. Not love that burned, but an understanding quiet enough to keep them both there. Many years had passed since that first winter they spent together. The land around Red Bluff was no longer wild and empty. Across the hill, the wooden fences they once built by hand now stretched around a small, thriving farm. In the garden, wildflowers grew freely, untamed but radiant, much like the life they had built. Althea walked slowly along the dirt path, her dress brushing the grass. Two children, a boy and a girl, were chasing each other beneath the apple tree, their laughter carried by the wind. Near the fence stood Grant, his hair streaked with gray, his stance still as steady as the day she first met him. When he turned, the morning sun caught his shoulder, glinting in the calm gray of his eyes. She called softly, "Grant, Mrs. Mercer's here." Down the dirt road, a small wagon approached, wheels creaking gently. The older woman climbed down, her posture bent, but her eyes bright. She took Althea's hands, thin, warm, and trembling slightly. "My heavens," she murmured. "I never thought this place would turn into something like this. You've built what most folks only dream of." Althea smiled, guiding her through the garden. "We just planted and tended. The land did the rest." Mrs. Mercer looked around. The barn, the fence line, the wooden cabin with its 2 windows. "Are you happy, Althea?" "For the first time, I think I am." Grant came over, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, dipping his head politely. "It's good to see you." She chuckled. "I'm not surprised. I knew the day she left Red Bluff she wasn't running away. She was searching." They ate lunch on the porch. The children's laughter rang through the yard, mingling with the smell of cornbread and coffee. Althea looked around. Their life was modest, but true. A roof over their heads, a husband steady through every season, 2 children untouched by fear, a patch of land that fed them, and a few horses grazing beyond the fence. By the time Mrs. Mercer departed, the sun had dipped low. Althea walked her to the gate, then turned back to find Grant sitting on the steps, waiting. He looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that asked for nothing. She sat beside him, resting her hands on her knees. In the distance, the children's voices echoed across the valley. The last light of the day glowed faintly through his hair. She looked at him, saying nothing. In her mind, a thought passed softly, like wind. He was once paid to save lives, but he saved mine not with his hands, but by letting me live. Grant turned to her. "What are you thinking?" She shook her head. "Only that. I never thought my life could be this peaceful." He smiled, faint crow's feet deepening around his eyes. "Peaceful, but not dull. You feel it too, don't you?" She nodded. "Like morning light. It doesn't dazzle, but it shows you what really matters." The breeze carried the sound of horses from the barn and the laughter of their children. The sky shifted from gold to rose to pale blue. They sat there without another word. Night came gently, like a blanket over a land that had finally stopped trembling. In the small house with 2 windows, the oil lamp glowed, spilling a soft beam across the earth. Steady, warm, alive. Peace, she thought, isn't something the world grants you. It's something you build. One breath, one morning, one act of care at a time. Grant reached over and took her hand, one once trembling, one long weathered by sun and work. Their fingers interlaced, strong as roots. On the porch, beneath the fading light, they sat watching their children race through the tall grass, wildflowers folding with the dusk. No promises were spoken. None were needed. Because what remained, love, home, light, had already proven itself true. Some stories don't need an ending, only a quiet evening long enough to realize how far you've come. And so it was with Althea Rivers and Grant McCoy. No grand vows, no celebration, no brilliance to close the tale. Only two once-broken souls choosing to stay together in a small house through the winter. They never tried to forget their pasts. They simply learned to live beside them, the way one learns to live with a scar, not with pain, but with gratitude for having healed. Althea still taught the village children to read. Grant still mended fences, fed the horses, and patched the roof. Their lives weren't remarkable, but they reminded anyone who passed that love can exist without spectacle, as long as two people stay when the winds rise. Each morning, when sunlight poured through the second window they had built together, it landed on the table, the coffee cups, the two wooden chairs worn smooth by familiar hands. Althea looked out, watching snow melt into streams, and smiled. Not everyone gets a second beginning, but if there is a place to return to, even a small house on a quiet hill, life is still beautiful. Grant stepped in, laid his rough hand on her shoulder, saying nothing. For them, that touch was blessing enough. They no longer needed proof of anything. Because what still stood, after all the years, was not fear, but the peace of two hearts that had finally found their home. And perhaps, somewhere out in the cold, if one passes through Red Bluff, they'll see a warm light glowing from that little house with two windows. That light isn't just fire. It's proof that love endures, even after time and loss have worn everything else thin. If this story brings you a bit of calm, share a comment below. Tell us, what do you believe true love is? A promise? Or simply staying when everything else has gone? Don't forget to like this video if it warmed your heart, and subscribe for more Wild West love stories, tales of kindness, forgiveness, and the quiet faith that blooms even through the snow. Because sometimes all we need is someone patient enough to stay through the winter.